So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for the third webinar of our digitization series, Preparing for Digitization. To those of you who are new, my name is Caitlin and I am the Special Collections Consultant here at the Northern New York Library Network. For those of you who have joined me for past sessions, welcome back. I'm going to go over a few housekeeping things before we get started. This session is being recorded and is going to be available to rewatch. Anybody who has registered will receive the slides and the recording in an email. The recording is also going to be posted on our YouTube channel. Information today is, and my watch is talking to me now. Okay, the information that I'm presenting today is a combination of my experience as a practicing archivist and also research that I have done for this purpose. If you have any questions as we go along, please feel free to put those in the Q&A section or in the chat. And I'm going to do my best to answer them either when we come to natural breaking points, and I'll definitely leave time at the end to go over them. So if everyone is all set, let me check on participants one more time. Let's get started. So for those of you who are joining for the first time, I just want to take a little bit of time to introduce myself and share a background about who I am and why I'm here talking about digitization. So I grew up in Northern New York in Franklin County and went to SUNY Potsdam for my undergraduate work, where I fell in love with local history and found out how cool it is. So then I decided to go to Boston, where I earned my master's degree in library and information science with a concentration in archives management. I did that at Simmons College, which is now Simmons University. Since then, I have been a practicing archivist working at a number of institutions where I was usually the only archivist on staff. I was a photographer at the Northeast Document Conservation Center, where I learned a lot about cultural heritage photography and got to work with incredible collections from across the country. Then I was a curator and archivist for a private historical society in Massachusetts. Being the only member on the staff that was dedicated to the collections, I got to wear many, many hats, which I'm sure a lot of you do as well. And one of those tasks that I was managing was setting up a digitization program from scratch. And you can see a picture of me on this slide testing some workflows and testing the equipment on a bound when I was imaging a bound ledger. Most recently, before I moved back to New York, I was an academic archivist at Occidental College in California. Part of why I was drawn to the field is because I really love to learn. And I feel like being an archivist or being a librarian, you're always getting to learn a little bit about something. So I like to keep my skills sharp and keep up with the field. So this year, I completed a certificate program through the Society of American Archivists to become a digital archive specialist. So this means that I took a bunch of classes and exams to become more knowledgeable about how to care for digital files. I started here at Nylon in July, and I'm very excited to be here to serve our members that have special collections and help out. When I'm not at Nylon, I run my own consulting business where I provide for archival consultations and also digitization services. So where have we been and where are we going? So as a reminder, we are now on webinar 3 out of 6. This one is preparing for digitization. These sessions have been designed to build upon each other and kind of progress towards working towards having a basic digitization program when we get to the end. So if you want to join me for the whole series, that's great. And that's really how it's designed to be viewed. But if you just want to refresh on one area, I totally get that. And you're more than welcome to just join and pop in to refresh yourself on like one topic or whatever you need. If you are joining for the first time or you want to catch up on what we've been over so far, the previous sessions are posted on our YouTube channel in a playlist for the series. So just to recap on what we have talked about up until this point, since we are kind of building on our skills, is in webinar 1, we went over the broad concepts of digitization, what it is, why we might want to or not want to do it. Last time we took a closer look at starting a digitization program, kind of what do we need in place to think about that. So that included talking about digital collection development policies, what they are, and the components that make them up. So that included selection criteria. I mean, after all, we can't or shouldn't or don't have time to digitize everything. So now that we know how to pick what we want to try to digitize, we need to figure out how we're actually going to do that. So today we're going to talk about what are the resources, so whether it be tools, equipment, people, knowledge that you need to be able to do digitizing, especially thinking about in-house. What specifications should we be digitizing to? Or in other words, what do we want the quality of our end product to be? How do we prepare our physical materials to be ready for imaging? These are all the questions that we're going to be answering as we work through our time together today. And there's a lot of information packed into this session. Some of it's a little more technical than the last two webinars have been, but hang on, we're going to be okay. I'm going to do my best to keep us moving and within our hour of time. So we are going to start with creating what I'm calling a digitization plan. Now, for those of you who did join me last time, you might be wondering how exactly is this different from the digital collection development policy that we were talking about. So if we remember, the policy was defining our digitization programs, the overarching purpose, its administration, it's that mission of why are we doing this and who are we serving? It was establishing our broad selection criteria to pick what to digitize in kind of a systematic way. It was also a policy that we could point to kind of defend our decisions or promote our program to go after funding support, anything like that. So it's kind of a governing document that can be used for public facing support. So it doesn't usually get edited very often because it is kind of that governing mission type document. Now, switching gears, a digitization plan. 1 minute while I admit someone. A digitization plan is going to be a new document that we're going to be using for our internal use, so our staff, our volunteers, anybody working with the collections, and it's going to serve as like a day-to-day or like a how-to direction manual for how the kind of the nitty-gritty of how digitization is done at your institution specifically. It's going to outline the decisions and the processes for digitization, like I said, that are specific to your institution. It should be written in a way that is detailed and explicit. So think of a direction manual you've maybe gotten when you have a piece of furniture to put together, or maybe a tutorial that you followed that was really, really easy to understand and follow. Chances are that the reason it was so easy to follow is that it probably had written instructions. It might have had diagrams or pictures. It was like very clear about what you were supposed to be doing and what tools and pieces you needed to do that. So this is the type of detail that we're going to want to capture for a digitization plan. So this document is going to be edited as changes and new things are learned or needed, or your program kind of grows and develops. So we're going to think of this like a living document. All of the rest of the sessions in this series are going to be contributing to this digitization plan, this document, including our in-house workflow decisions for imaging or digitizing, the post-production steps to kind of clean things up and make them usable, and then how we maintain and store these files. So today we're going to focus on two of these components or sections. We're going to assess what your in-house capabilities or resources are for digitization work. And then we're also going to talk about workflows, we're going to also talk about, before we get to workflows, we're going to talk about what you want your end product quality to be like, and how do you kind of decide what you want those quality or specifications to be. And then we also are going to start to touch on workflows a little bit and the concrete steps that you want to take to actually make this happen. But like I said, a lot of that is going to be covered more in the following 3 webinars. So our digitization plan is going to capture the day-to-day process of how to actually do digitizing at our institutions. Like, cool, okay, but like, why do we want to do all this work to create this documentation? And there's a few reasons that having this digitization plan kind of in your toolkit is going to be a really, really great asset. So the first thing is having a written plan is going to save you a lot of time. I'm sure we're all juggling multiple tasks that include more than just doing digitization. And that's not the only thing that's on your plate right now. So I'm pretty sure that you probably don't want to spend time making the same decision over and over and over again. So wouldn't it be better just to do good research, make the decision once, write down what that decision was, and then just refer back to that? So that's really what this plan is going to allow us to do, is we're going to be able to kind of make that decision once and then kind of have a template of what to follow. And like I said, this could change over time. You may want to amend it, but it sorry, I'm tweaking a setting. But it's going to definitely help us kind of move through things more efficiently. And I'm a huge proponent for documentation for all kinds of processes, but today we're going to just focus on digitization. So not only does documenting these decisions save you time, it's also going to create consistency in your program. And consistency with special collections is really, really important because we want to make sure that we understand how and why things were done to collections so we can potentially undo them if we had to, or just to know how they've been treated over time. So if you have a set of written instructions outlining exactly what to do and the steps to get there, what end product you should be getting, then you should be able to get the same end results every single time, no matter who is digitizing or on what day. This becomes especially important when you have staff that turns over, or maybe you have volunteers and interns that are coming in and out. And like I said, it helps you know what decisions have been made and why, so you can then make informed tweaks to the program or whatever you need. Having these explicitly written instructions and consistency is also going to help reduce how many errors are made. Digitization has a lot of steps to it, a lot of moving parts. So it's really easy to accidentally skip over something or let something kind of fall through the gaps. So by having this kind of manual checklist written down to go through, it's going to make sure that everything that needs to happen gets done. And when your expectations for what the process and your end results should be are documented, the next thing that it's going to be able to help you with is making sure that that end product is what it's supposed to be. So you'll be able to do quality assurance, quality control on your work because you know what you're expecting to get at the end. So that's also a good way to cross-check the work that's being done. And then finally, as I alluded to while we talked about consistency, your digitization plan can serve as a training tool for new people at your institution, since it is kind of that how-to manual step-by-step through the process. Okay, so the first section of this digitization plan that we're going to talk about today are your in-house resources. So what do you have available to you now, or you can easily get access to at your institution? So the first thing we want to consider is kind of a lump of categories is what is your people power, your time, and your funding. So first, we're going to talk about kind of your people power and time. So we want to like look around our institution. Maybe you already know it. Maybe you need to go and ask someone about it. But who is available or has time to do work for your digitization project? How much time do these people have to work on it? And what skills or knowledge are required for this type of work? And does anyone in your institution already have those skills or knowledge, or is it something that you're kind of missing? So the nice thing about evaluating this and then writing it down is you're seeing what your strengths are, but you're also kind of finding what gaps you have to run a program so you can address those or account for them before you actually get into the thick of things. For funding, you're going to want to consider and kind of take note of what funds you have available or dedicated to digitization work. If you don't have a lot of funds, as you do have access to grants, or is there some other pool of funding that you could maybe get support from or apply for that could be used towards this type of work? What kind of ongoing support will this program need? So often with digitization, a lot of people think about doing the scanning, but then it is more of a long-term commitment to either keep being able to scan more materials and to actually store those files. Like, where are the files going to go? How are you going to make sure you can still get to them later? So funds you might want to think about for that include staffing, maybe software for your computer or cloud type subscription storage space, some kind of like storage cluster options if you have to pay for that, like subscription fees. What kind of hardware are you using? So what kind of like computers, scanners, cameras, devices do you need? And like they'll probably get old, wear out, whatever. So how often will they need to be replaced? And what kind of budgeting do you need to plan for to be able to have that available? And then if you are going to send your materials to a vendor to be digitized, how much is that going to cost? And how can you kind of build budgets to have the funds available to work with that? So the next thing we want to think about is the technology. What technology do you have access to? So this is going to be both hardware and software. So as we were just talking about a little bit with the funding, so what, scanners, computers, equipment do you have access to actually capture the images? What formats? So what material types can they actually digitize? Because sometimes it's a little different between devices of what they can do. What sizes can they accommodate? So for example, if you have a scanner, the scanner bed's probably a certain size, and that's the maximum size that you could have an object on there. So what is that limit? And finally, what are your storage options? So if you're using something like a hard drive, that's kind of a piece of hardware. You'll want to think about, like, what do you have? How big is it? How often will it need to be replaced? Is it backed up somewhere? And the same kind of questions apply to software. So do you have or need special software to actually capture the images with whatever kind of a device you have? What kind of software do you have or do you need so you can edit these pictures? You probably at least want to be able to crop and rotate them so they're easier to look at. Do you have a system to capture information about the files that you make? So is there some kind of content management system, spreadsheet, inventory, something that you're going to actually keep track of what files you made, where they live, things, basic things like that. And then again, we'll think about storage a little bit, because if you have cloud options, then it's not really a physical thing that you have to take care of, but still something you want to think about. So again, you're going to want to talk to people at your institution, do some research, and write down as much information as you can to know what you're working with. And finally, at least for our purposes today, we want to consider your facility itself. You're going to want to know, like, do you have dedicated space to have an imaging station set up and have room to move around and work with materials at it? So you want to make sure not only that your equipment can fit there, but that you can safely move materials to have them out to use, and also to move them on and off your imaging device safely. And especially thinking about, depending on what kind of materials you have, if you need multiple people, like, can the people maneuver in and out safely? So again, just jot down, kind of just taking a learning the lay of the land and noting what you have and what you can do. All right, on to section 2 of our digitization plan. So what quality standards or specifications do we want to achieve? So for the purposes of this webinar series, we're going to focus on still images of archival materials. So you may be wondering, what is a still image? It's actually easier to maybe say what it's not. So it's not audio or video content. It's going to be, we're going to be focusing on photographs or images of materials that do not move. So a photograph, a map, a page of a book, or something similar. There are specifications and information about other formats, including moving images. That's outside of the scope of what we're going to be focusing on in this series, in this presentation today. But if you do have specific questions, feel free to email me, and I'm happy to try to point you to some resources. Like I said, our big question today is how do you decide what specifications or quality goals to pick at your institution? Well, the answer, which at least I never like to hear, is it depends. It's always nice to have more concrete answers, but there is no one way to do it. It's really going to depend on your resources and materials institution. So those decisions are going to be unique to your institution and based on the factors that are being discussed in this webinar as well as the previous ones, including what do you want to do with your materials, like what is it for, and where are you going to put them, things of that nature. So we want to think about your plans, your program, your resources, and what's going to work best for you. So some of the reasons you might be digitizing that's going to impact the quality that you want to achieve are files. So you might be creating files for a quick reference scan. So maybe somebody sent in a research request and you just want to really quickly take some snapshots of it to get it in an email so they can just see kind of what it's about. If that's the case, you're probably not planning on keeping those files long term, and the quality doesn't really need to be high. It doesn't matter too much because it's just a quick reference thing. So that low resolution is probably fine. Like I said, quick snapshot. I've even done this for researchers where I just use my phone and take some quick images for reference. So it's kind of like the low quality idea. So then kind of your medium idea, which I have a feeling is where a lot of us are probably at, is you want to scan it for reference and reuse of the content. So it's not just a quick one-off thing for one researcher. You're hoping to kind of have it around, use it, share it, so you don't have to keep imaging it every time a researcher has a question. So we want that to be good quality, and because it's going to have the possibility to be reused for a longer span of time, maybe even for some other purpose, like an exhibit, a publication, social media, something like that. And then the last thing that I'm going to point out is you may be looking for what I'm calling the archival quality, or like I'm going to also call it the golden standard, or the Cadillac of archival files. So this is the highest quality that could be created, and we're going to get into what that means exactly a little bit later. But it's technically accurate, which means it's true to size of the original object. It's color accurate. The camera's been calibrated and adjusted for interpretations of color and a whole bunch of other technical things. But we won't go in too depth about today, but we'll glimpse a little bit. So this is a standard that a lot of large institutions with trained and dedicated staff, including photographers, imaging science professionals, this is a lot of times what they are striving to achieve. Kind of those institutions that kind of make the rules and make the guidelines. So it's extremely resource intensive for time, equipment, knowledge, people, but we should know that it exists and that these options are kind of a spectrum. So you're going to want to keep in mind where you might want to fall within this spectrum as we talk through the next several slides. So as I said, there's no one way to digitize and pick standards, but it is good to try to align yourself with best practices that are recognized by the field and strive to align with those and improve your program to be in line with them. So a really good idea is to kind of look around the field and look at programs at other institutions, especially those who are leaders in the field, to see what they are doing. And two leaders in the United States to look to are the Library of Congress and the National Archives. And really the big leader, like the leader that at least I'm aware of for cultural heritage digitization is something called FADGI. And FADGI stands for the Federal Agency Digitization Guidelines Initiative. I know that's a mouthful. So what FADGI is it's a collaborative effort that was started in 2007 by federal agencies to articulate common sustainable practices and guidelines for digitized and born digital historical, archival, and cultural content. So it's composed of two working groups. One focuses on still images and one focuses on audio visual. So we're going to be talking about the still image group today. So like I said, these guidelines are kind of known as the golden standard of cultural heritage reproduction. The still image section of FADGI has a rating system from 1 to 4 stars of how they kind of judge quality. And they have criteria for all kinds of different technical components to ensure that reproduction accuracy across institutions and technologies. So why do we care about all this? So not all cameras and devices and software, they don't all see and interpret things such as color in the same way. So what FADGI's goal is it creates measurements and kind of thresholds to help measure and account for these differences so that people can calibrate their systems so that the end result ends up being the same. So capturing the best likeness of original material is the main goal of cultural heritage photography. We want to make it as close and as accurate of the representation of that original object as possible. So all of these guidelines and measurements, like, don't get caught up in the weeds of that. But the whole goal of it is that we want to create as accurate to the original representation as possible. And these guidelines and measurements, what they're doing is they're trying to help us account for all the differences in our softwares and technologies so that we can make that happen. So the FADGI guidelines are very intense. I was introduced to them while I was a photographer at NEDCC, and I have read through parts of it, and I certainly do not understand all of it. But the good thing is they are guidelines, and they have some information and that we can kind of glean out for our own purposes, even if we're doing something on a smaller scale. And I want to make sure that you are aware that it exists. And like I said, we can use pieces of it and make it helpful for us. We just also can ignore a whole bunch of it for now, at least to start. So what we're going to do today is I've picked out 4 parameters or specifications of FADGI that we're going to look at today. So that includes file format, resolution, bit depth, and color mode. As you can see on the slide, there's some other things grayed out. Like I said, there's a whole bunch in there, but we don't need to worry about those right now. If you are interested in them, or depending on where you are in your program, feel free to explore. There are links that will be in the slides that are emailed to you in the recommended resources and references. If you want to read more, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there. So I've chosen these 4 for today because they are the specifications that you likely are going to have control over at your institution and on your devices. We are going to get a little bit more technical in this next section, but I'm going to try to stick to simple descriptions so we just know what these specifications are and why we care about them for cultural imaging. So hang on. So we're going to start with file formats for our digitized images. So what is a file format? Chances are a lot of you already know this, deal with it every day, but I'm going to go over it anyway. So if you look at the names of files on your computer, you have likely noticed that there's a period and then it's followed with a bunch of random letters at the end of each one. So you might have like .jpg, .pdf. So these are important because they tell the computer and us what type of file they are so that the computer knows how to understand them and what software to open them for us to be able to view and use. So what type of files are we going to want to make when we digitize? For digitizing archival materials or still images, as FADGI refers to it, we usually want to create 2 sets of files. So while we're actually digitizing or scanning, we create something called a master file. And this is also sometimes called an archival or a preservation file. There might be other names out there too. This file is going to be an unedited representation of the original scan. So the only edits we might make to it is to crop it or rotate it, but we don't want to do any contrast, color corrections, anything, because as I mentioned when we started, the goal of cultural heritage photography is to get as close of a likeness to the original as possible. So we want to do minimal editing on this master file. For this, we usually use a format called TIFF, which stands for a tagged image file format. This file is used because it can store really, really high resolution. They're called raster graphics, which gives us a really high quality file. It also is considered a lossless file, which refers to the level of compression happening to the file when it's like stored and tucked away. So a lossless compression means that we don't lose any data when that's compressed for storage. So in other words, a TIFF file is really great being a master file for still images because it's really high resolution and we don't lose any data when it's kind of tucked away and stored. The one kind of drawback is that it does make for a really large file size, but that's okay because we don't care about that for this purpose because we're going to make a second type of file. And the second set of files is called an access file or sometimes a derivative file. So while we have that big high resolution master, we're going to tuck that away for safekeeping. The access files are going to serve for our everyday use and reference the reference versions that we're going to share either use with staff or the public or anybody who's interested in our collections. And then these are the files that if you want to make them pretty and edit them in contrast, you can kind of have multiple copies. And these are the files to do things to it to use. So access copies for still images are most often in a format called JPEG. This stands for Joint Photographic Experts Group. I had to look that up because I use the abbreviation so much. And it's actually named after the group of who made the standard of JPEG. These are different than the TIFFs because a JPEG file has a different kind of compression type. It's called lossy instead of lossless. So in lossy compression, some of the data is deleted, which then lets that file be a little bit smaller. So to our eyes, it looks the same, but behind the scenes is all the little bits and bytes of a file. Some data is gone. So like I said, that's okay for our access files because it's easier if they're smaller because then we can share and use them more easily. And then very quickly, I'm just gonna mention that once in a while, we'll also create an additional type of access file, usually in the form of a PDF. And this is really useful for materials that have a lot of text in them, like administrative records, pamphlets, reports, correspondence, things of that nature. Because you can take a bunch of your JPEG access files and combine them together to create a PDF. And what that does is it's going to let you look at all of them in one place. You can kind of scroll through the document in that one file instead of having to open it one image at a time. So if you're reading something, it's really annoying to have to open one file after another to turn the page. The other really, really nice thing about the PDF file is that you can run, it's called optical character recognition on it, or OCR. And this is what lets the computer does its magic, and then you can actually search for words in the document, which is really helpful for research. And that feature works really, really well on type text. There are different softwares that are getting a lot better at doing handwriting too, but from my experience, the handwriting is kind of hit and miss. So it's good to test that if you do decide to use it. Okay, so that's file formats. So now we're going to move on to our second factor that we're going to look at, and this is called resolution. So you're likely going to have some setting that you can type in what you want this number to be. So resolution is the level of detail that's contained in an image. So you may have noticed when you look at some images, especially if you try to make them bigger, that they appear kind of fuzzy or blurry, almost pixelated, like the image that's on the right on this slide. Why does this happen? And what's going on behind the scenes? So we're going to look at that just to try to understand more about what this is. So if we were to zoom in on a digital image, you would end up seeing a whole bunch of tiny little squares of color. These little squares are the building blocks of an image, and they are called pixels. But how do the pixels get in our image? So if we think about how the image is captured, A camera is a lot like our eyes in the sense that it has a receptor that takes in light and information and it converts it into a signal that can be perceived as an image. So in a camera's case, that receptor is called an image sensor. And this sensor is made up of a grid of millions of these tiny little light capturing pixels. They're, like I said, they can capture light, information, they're very sensitive. And when we take an image, these tiny pixels capture information that's then converted into the signal that makes our picture. So you may have heard of resolutions being measured in what's called PPI, which stands for pixels per inch. So when we are putting the setting on our camera or a scanner, we're deciding when we have that, we're deciding how many little squares or pixels are going to capture information within each physical inch of space. So if you pick a low resolution, then there are less pixels that are capturing that information and that data per square inch. And if you pick a higher resolution number, then there are more pixels capturing information within that same inch. So therefore, you're going to capture more detail and more definition of whatever you're scanning or imaging. So if we look at the diagram on the slide, you can see the left-hand most example that is 1 pixel per inch, which means within 1 inch, so like a physical inch, there would be 1 pixel capturing information. But if we look at the far right and we capture 8 pixels per inch, now we have 64 pixels in that same inch capturing information in detail. So that's quite a difference. And it's going to result in a lot more detail in our image. So one thing, so you're like, this all sounds great, right? Why would you ever do a lower resolution? But you want to keep in mind that the more detail and the more information that you're capturing, the larger that your file size is getting. So you're going to want to keep your storage in mind, or weigh those factors of storage space, cost, expense versus quality, depending on what you're doing with your files. So now if you have a scanner, and at least that's where I've seen this, you may be like thinking to yourself, I don't know what PPI is, but I have this thing called DPI. So DPI stands for dots per inch. And it's mostly, it kind of came about and it's used because it's a measurement for print resolution, which I guess makes sense that the scanners on printers are often measured in that. But for our case, you don't really have to worry about it. We're going to use them interchangeably. So PPI, DPI, pixels per inch, dots per inch, doesn't matter. It's all going to be the same for us. But just know that the pixels version is usually related to measurements for digital cameras, and the dots per inch are for the print resolution, or the tiny little the ink droplets that the printer would put out. All right, so we're going to move on to the third specification that we're going to look at today, and that is bit depth. So now we're going to think back to that camera's image sensor. We talked about can absorb that information, kind of like our eyes can. And that there are a whole bunch of little pixels that capture that information. So what bit depth is talking about is it's specifying how much color information specifically is available for each pixel to record or capture. So in other words, how much color information can be captured. So in this example here, you can see that the levels of color representation, whether it be in grayscale, like the image on the left, or in color, like the example on the right, in both of the examples, we can see that the lower the number of the bit depth is, the more kind of distinct or hard boundaries there are between colors. So if we look first at the one on the left, that's kind of in that grayscale, we see at 1 bit, we only have black or white. And then in our color example, if we look at the 4-bit results, we have these very hard distinctions between colors. like red and orange and yellow, and there's nothing really in between. But as the bit depth increases, we start to see more of a spectrum or a gradient of color, since more color information is able to be captured by those little pixels. So we get all the colors in between, those main colors, such as the grays in the left example. You see there's more of a smooth transition, and you get more of the grays in the middle. And then in the color version, you're also getting more of those in between colors. And you don't really have those harsh lines or lines at all. It's more of that kind of rainbow where you get the red oranges and yellow oranges and the colors that are in between. So you get more color combinations. So more bits of information per pixel. So the more information a pixel can absorb, that results in more available colors, which we really like in special collection and cultural heritage field, because the more colors we have to pick from or to be captured, the more accurate that our image is likely to be to the original object. So the final specification that we're going to look at today is called color mode. So color mode is going to determine how the colors are combined and how all that processing in the back end happens in order to create an image. So this is going to determine the resulting levels of color detail and also the file size. So as we've kind of seen the trend, the more information we capture, the bigger our file is going to be. So what does color mode, what does this really mean? So different equipment sees colors and has the ability to produce colors in different kinds of ways, just because of the technology that it is. So for example, printers interpret color in a mode called CMYK, and these letters stand for the colors that it's using. So cyan, magenta, yellow, and then K stands for key, which is black. Digital screens, that technology is a little different. So instead of having those 4 colors, digital screens like a computer monitor, they interpret color best in a mode called RGB, which stands for red, green, and blue. And RGB can combine to allow us to see millions of colors, while CMYK, and other modes are more limited in the color combinations that they can produce. So for digitization of archival materials, we mostly care about 2 modes. The first mode we care about, which is circled, is number 1, and that's the color or the RGB mode. And as we were talking about, and as I mentioned, this lets us produce millions and millions of colors combinations. So in order to best represent the colors in our original object, we really like this option because it gives us that to best represent that original material as accurately as possible, be able to see what's like in real life and how we see it in our eyes. The other mode we sometimes use is called grayscale, and that's the circled number 4. Digital images in this mode are produced using ranges of grays, which we kind of saw back on that bit slide. Grays that range between pure white and pure black. This is used mostly for like black and white negatives and photographs or materials where there is no color information to capture. At least in my experience, that's how it's been used. So when we pick our color mode, we usually want to match it to the color format of our original materials. All right, so as I mentioned, we're going to take a quick skim through FADGI just so you can kind of see pieces of it. It's a lot more detailed than what we need, so I've just pulled out kind of the sections that we talked about today. So these tables that I'm going to be showing you is from what's called Chapter 3 of FADGI. And if you look at nothing else, I think Chapter 3 is a great place to start, just to kind of know like what resolution might I want to pick. So whether you're digitizing yourself or you decide to work with a vendor, I think it's really good to have these things in mind because it'll let you have an informed conversation to make sure you can get a product that aligns with your institutional and your professional program goals. Okay, so now we're going to look at a couple examples just to see how we might want to read. How can we understand these FADGI charts to be something useful to us? Like I said, there's way more information than we need. So up first, this is an example of one of the tables for loose documents. So think anything that's paper-based, only on one sheet or leaf, and is not photographic material. So maybe a letter, a report, some kind of administrative document, something like that. So when we look at the table, how we want to read it is the columns stand for those star ratings I mentioned. So 1 would be the lower quality option, and 4 would be the highest quality option. And then each of the rows represents one of those specifications that we looked at. And like I said, there's a whole bunch more, but we're not going to worry about that. So we start with our master file format, and we already kind of talked about the pros and cons of those different formats, TIFF, JPEGs, PDF, when you might want to use them and how. Resolution is one I want to spend a little bit of time on. So as you can see, as we look across the columns, the resolution number from 1 to 4 goes up. This is something you may want to consider as you are deciding what kind of resolution you want, if you want guidance. So if we want to do the highest quality resolution that's recommended for loose documents in this chart, we'd have 400 pixels per inch if we look at what's in the parentheses, which means 400 of those tiny little pixels are capturing information within 1 square inch. So a little bit different than our example that we were looking at. And then I'm also going to lump the bit depth and the color information together for the purposes of looking at this chart. Since it's all kind of related, we're talking about color and capturing color. And you're going to notice that once they make very specific recommendations of settings and things, you may have control over some of this, you may not, which is, it's going to be so unique to this institution. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but you'll notice that the higher the star rating, usually the higher the quality, which would make the bigger image file. So our next example is for prints and photographs. So please note that here we are talking about, we're not talking about negatives. That's covered in a different table. And it's very similar to the last table we looked at. The one thing I want to point out, because I do want to be mindful of time, is that the resolution here is different than when we looked at loose documents. So when you look at the 4-star for the loose documents, our top number was 400 pixels per inch. And the recommendations when we get into prints and photographs is 600 pixels per inch. So now we're going to be capturing 600 pixels are going to be capturing information instead of 400. So a lot of times with these like visual mediums, the level of detail captured is higher. So you'll want to think about within your own institution, whether you use these numbers or not, do you have certain types of media that have more information to be captured, that you want to capture more information than others? So photographs usually have a lot of detail to capture, where something like a document of text may not have as much. So that's a little bit lower. Okay, the last section that we're going to talk about today is preparing our physical materials for digitization. So we kind of talked about it last time in nominating collections of like, how do you initially evaluate a collection to know if it's in good enough condition and has interesting enough content that we want to digitize it. So in our final kind of one last look before we actually get to a camera, we might have a few other things that we want to consider. I do want to point out, as always, and you'll keep hearing this again and again, but the safety of our materials is our #1 priority when we are working with them. So we want to make sure we account for that. And this step is gonna help us do that. So how do we evaluate materials in a way that's useful for digitization? And if you have an inventory or collection record, this is a great time to add to it. And if you don't, this is a great time to make one. To note some of the factors that are on the slide, which I will definitely talk about. So I like to use a spreadsheet when I do this. So each item, or maybe folder level, depending on what kind of level of detail you're going into, is going to get a row on your spreadsheet. So then you can make notes about it. So what kinds of things are going to go in the row for information? So I like to note the items, its unique physical identifier, so that we know what the item that we're talking about is. We're also going to note the format that the material is, or the material type that are present. Are they all the same? Or do we have intermixed or different kinds of things in the same folder or the same storage container. So do you have a folder of correspondence? Is there a photographic print mixed in? Maybe there's a negative in there. So since different materials are going to have different quality settings when we do scanning or imaging, we're going to want to make sure we know what is where as we go along. And then we can make a plan of how to address that. Another thing we want to know besides format is what size of the materials. So early on, I mentioned that you may have limitations based on your devices. So if you have a scanner bed that's only a certain size, you won't be able to scan anything that's bigger than that because it'll be outside of the window. So you're going to want to make a note of how many different sizes are present and where is this going to impact what kind of settings that you need to have or how they can be handled. I like to keep a flexible measuring tape handy, which I meant to have to show you and I didn't bring it today. Just to do this kind of work and just take quick measurements because it won't harm the object and it's really handy to use. Usually like a lot of craft stores have them. What condition are the materials in when we look at them in closer detail? So we talked about the collection level last time, but this time we're kind of getting in the folders and getting in maybe the envelopes and figuring out what's there. So is there any kind of condition concerns? Are they fragile, brittle? Is something ripped that you want to be careful about to handle when you're done? Do any materials need this like a special care of some kind? So you're going to want to note this in the sheet so it can serve as a guide during your digitization, and they can kind of be flagged for you to pay extra attention to. And then is there any type of information about the materials that you want to capture? So this is a really good time if there's inscriptions, anything like that, you can capture that information, maybe come up with a plan of how you want to name your files if it's a complicated collection, but we'll talk about that more in our post-processing webinar. So now that you know what you can do in-house, what kind of resources you have, what kind of quality you want to get, and what kind of conditions the material are in, you can decide if this is something that you think you can do yourself or want to do yourself, or if it's something that you want to send out to a vendor. As I mentioned, this is all really, really good information to have so that you can have informed discussions with a vendor to make sure they're going to handle your material safely and that you're going to get the end product that you want. So a little end cap, I want to make sure that I have time to take some questions. We talked about digitization plans and why they're useful, why we might want them, and the parts of them, including assessing what we have at our own institutions and our capabilities, as well as how we may want to decide what kind of quality that we want to achieve and what that might look like and the factors we have control over. And then finally, we just talked about some of the things we might want to think about to prepare our materials, to know what we have and the conditions they're in, and to actually scan them and how they're going to align with our capabilities. So if you're feeling overwhelmed, which I really hope you're not, here's a moment to remember to start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. Each step you take is going to make your institution better a little bit at a time, and we all have to start somewhere. If you do want to join me again for the next session, that's going to be November 21st. At 11 a.m. and we're going to get into digital imaging. So actually starting to do scanning and thinking about workflows, handling all of those sorts of things, applying the specifications. So if you want to learn more about that or register for that, either it's going to be a QR code on the next slide that you can scan. You can also go to our website, nnyln.org. And if you get our newsletters, the links are also in there. So with that, I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you so much for joining me today to learn how to prepare for digitization. As I mentioned, I'll stop the recording and then I'll get to your questions. So feel free to drop those in the chat or the Q&A. And if you don't have time to stick around, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm more than happy to answer any questions that way as well.